Welcome, everybody. I'm going to wait just a moment to get started while people join us. Thanks for being here. Welcome, everybody. I think we will go ahead and begin now. I want to, first of all, just thank everybody for joining us today. I'm Jennifer Mnookin, and I have the good luck to be Dean here at UCLA School of Law. And it's a pleasure to have you with us today for the audience members and also for this terrific panel on this very important topic. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that UCLA School of Law sits on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tonka peoples. As members of a land-grant institution, we at UCLA pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives, past, present, and emerging. You're joining us today for the latest installment in our From the Frontline virtual series. In these very challenging times, we at UCLA School of Law are fortunate to have faculty, alumni, and friends who are among foremost experts in the legal, social, and political issues that are at the heart of the current conversation. And in this speaker series, we try to bring some of those conversations to our community writ large. Last week, as the trial of Donald Trump unfolded in the Senate, scenes of the insurrection at the United States Capitol reminded all of us about the threat of homegrown extremism and the ways that it's very real and a growing concern to all of us. It has rightfully become a central issue in our national discourse, a conversation that particularly impacts law enforcement personnel, lawyers, and legal scholars, as well, of course, as the population at large. Today, I'm joined by three excellent panelists to help us better understand this phenomenon and the ways in which law and law enforcement and the public can and should grapple with this deeply troubling issue, and perhaps also how we can understand it and contextualize it in relationship to other kinds of threats of extremism and terrorism that have been part of our national discourse over recent decades. First, I'm delighted to welcome my colleague, UCLA Law School professor Asli Bali. Asli is the faculty director of our Promise Institute for Human Rights, and she focuses her research on international security, human rights law, and much more as well. She's a prolific and very distinguished scholar who writes on topics that include institutional design in religiously divided societies, nuclear non-proliferation regimes, and international legal arguments concerning humanitarian intervention. And she's just a superb scholar, teacher, and colleague. Welcome, Asli. Katrina Mulligan serves as the acting vice president for national security and international policy at the Center for American Progress, where she focuses on intelligence, screening and vetting, surveillance, and counterterrorism. Katrina is a graduate of UCLA Law School and previously worked as an attorney advisor and director for preparedness and response in the National Security Division of the United States Department of Justice. Welcome back virtually to UCLA Law School, Katrina. Delighted to have you with us today. Erroll is professor of the practice in national and homeland security at USC's Saul Price School of Public Policy, where he directs the Safe Communities Institute and Homegrown Violent Extremism Studies. During his long and distinguished career in government, he served as an FBI special agent and in multiple counterterrorism and public safety positions. He's a renowned expert in counterterrorism and in particularly in homegrown violent extremism, our topic for today, and more. Welcome across town virtually. Delighted to have you, Erroll. So welcome to everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to begin with one question for each of our panelists, if that's okay, and give them each 3 to 5 minutes to give us an answer. And then we'll open it up to a more general conversation. And in addition, if those of you listening would like to ask questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function. And I don't know that I'll be able to get to all of your questions, but we will do our very best to get to some of them. So please feel free to jump in that way as well. So Erroll, let me begin with you. Homegrown violent extremists have become a pretty significant part of the conversation in the wake of the insurrection at the Capitol. But it's not a phenomenon that emerged overnight. Can you help our audience understand how we got to a moment where armed, organized groups were able to overtake the Capitol Police during the very moment that lawmakers were certifying the most important of national elections? I realize it's a big question, but I'd love to have you help us begin to understand the origins of the groups and movements that we're hearing so much about right now, such as the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Boogaloo, and QAnon. Could you help us find a way into all of this?
Well, Dean, first, thank you for having me here today from across town. In the interest of full disclosure, I'm a former senior fellow in your School of Public Affairs. I'm married to a Bruin. I guess I'm married to a Brogan because now she's got her doctorate from USC. So we live in a house divided and we're very, very much in love with each other. So everything works great. So let me just get us here. And what I'll do is I'm going to go back to the 1980s when I was in the FBI. And a time when actually someone who was pretty prominent at the time, I'm going to go give you some historical perspective with regards to how these groups came about, because they didn't just come here overnight. In 1992, there was a book put out by a gentleman named Louis Beam, who's still alive, called Leaderless Resistance. And what's interesting is that that book came out just months before the shootout that the FBI had with Randy Weaver, who was a Christian identity movement person. The reason that's important is because that Leaderless Resistance book talked about hierarchical pyramidal organizations, government structures, and why they wouldn't work if you're going to be in a movement that was anti-government. He also tried to usher this right-wing, if you will, extremism at the time into the computer age when we hardly had any computers. He ran into another group at the time called the Covenant, the Sword, and Arm of the Lord, CSA. And what you may not know is that Timothy McVeigh also had connectivity with that group before he attacked the Murrah Building in 1995. The reason I bring those individuals up is because CSA actually surveilled the Murrah Building in 1983, 12 years before the attack. What's interesting about his theory were two things. Number one was that the government was a threat to liberty. It was already oppressive. So now you start to get this anti-government flavor already. And he talked about committees of correspondence, which were known more than what we would call terrorist cells today. Long and behold, the 80s come around, we have these compound battles with a number of organizations. Ruby Ridge, Whidbey Island, Waco comes along later on. But what's important is that white nationalism starting to build, mostly with a gentleman named Dr. William Hale, who you may know because he wrote the Turner Diaries under the pseudonym Andrew McDonald. What are they based on? Racial hatred, separatist ideologies, anti-Semitism, and most importantly, what's taking hold now, conspiracy theories, like 9/11, like the 2001 anthrax attack. Oklahoma City comes along. We don't pay attention to McVeigh. He's the aberration. He's a veteran. He kills Americans, but not too long after we have 9/11. 9/11 is a game changer. 9/11 is a game changer for a lot of reasons, because now we have a religious minority from overseas that we can go after, and we do. No holds barred. What people may not know is that on 9/11, the gentleman named August Crease reached out to Al-Qaeda from Pennsylvania, having been a grand wizard in the Klan and a member of Aryan Nations and Posse Comitatus, to ask Al-Qaeda if they would join with the Klan because we had a common enemy. So moving to today, 2006, there's an FBI report that comes out warning of the white supremacist threat, warning of the infiltration of white supremacists into American policing. The concerns there are obvious: leaks about investigations, giving these individuals more access than they would other people, and most importantly, increasing the risks of sabotage. How ironic that those are all the things that happened on January 6th. 2009, you probably all know about the Department of Homeland Security's Intelligence and Analysis report that came out. I happened to be President Obama's nominee at the time, and I wish I could have talked to Secretary Napolitano to say, don't label it the way you're going to. It was labeled right-wing extremism. It was dead on arrival. They disbanded the unit. They pulled the report. I remember her apologizing to veterans because in that report, it made note of the fact that veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan would be prime targets for recruitment by these organizations. We move forward to 2017 when Charlottesville happens and the Unite the Right rally. That puts an incredible disparate group of right-wing extremist organizations under the same umbrella, groups that do not play well together, but for that day had a common enemy. But what's important about that day is the fact that they shared intelligence with each other and they shared intelligence with law enforcement to say, these are the counter protesters that are going to be there to attack us that day. If things aren't going bad enough, COVID hits us. COVID I define as the race, religion, and issue-oriented extremism trifecta, because now you have organizations who, under the umbrella of government overreach, can recruit and radicalize against this government now that wants us to wear a mask, that wants us to stay home, that tells us we can't go to the gym. But what's important about that, underneath all of that, white supremacists and neo-Nazis are telling people, spread COVID to law enforcement and Jews. We saw a 182% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the United States between Charlottesville and the COVID-19 shutdown. So I'll get to where we are now. The Capitol protests that happened during COVID and the kidnap plots were just a precursor to what was going on behind the scenes. And all the rest you already know. January 6th comes along. We have these organizations that, I know we can talk about data later, but that have been building momentum over time, that have been emboldened by an administration that pivots away from investigating them and prosecuting them. And they feel like they're emboldened, they've got a friend in the White House, and they try to take over our government in no less than an insurrection, if not a coup.
Thanks for that chilling but very helpful introduction. I've also been told that I was having problems with my sound system. Is this better? Okay, good. I hope this is working better. I'd like to turn next to a question for Asli. And I'd love to have you tell us a little bit. Some of your scholarship has focused on the way in which law grapples with terrorism more broadly. After 9/11, we saw a number of new laws come into effect to try to mitigate the threats that were perceived then. Do existing laws here in the US address the actions that we saw at the Capitol? And are they well set up to think about homegrown terrorism and extremism? What existing legal tools and strategies do we have to address this threat? And what thoughts do you have about worries or what else might be necessary?
Thanks so much, Jennifer, for hosting this conversation, inviting me to join it. I'll pick up right where Erroll left off. I think that we have all the existing tools necessary to address the threat that was manifest in the attack on the Capitol, but our government's priorities have long failed to deploy these tools and these resources appropriately. So let me just begin by noting the undeniably stark contrast between the treatment of the mostly white rioters at the Capitol and the brutal police crackdown that we saw against largely peaceful racial justice protests earlier this year. I think there's a lot that lies behind this really important contrast, but I want to underscore one thing. The danger and risk that this form of homegrown extremism poses is itself evident in the reception that these rioters had in DC. They were able to breach the Capitol in part because when they said, "This is our house," they were asserting a kind of entitlement and belonging that was not instantly received as threatening, as it should have been, but rather, alarmingly, it was a sort of familiar claim that may have even struck some of the law enforcement officials and other responsible agencies that were there in DC at that moment as plausible. And this is, I think, where the root is of this mistaken prioritization by responsible agencies about how tools are used in the face of white supremacists. I'm not suggesting here, of course, that we should have more brutal policing of all communities or that we should brandish the terrorism designation more broadly to encompass more and more people. Black and brown communities and Muslims in the US have been over-policed under the guise of safety and national security, and I don't think we should stretch that over-policing to more and more groups. To broaden the license for repressive policing or the use of the terrorism category would just reinforce systems that I think instead need to be transformed. But I do think it's important to understand that the problem isn't the absence of powers in the government, but the failure to make hate crimes and white supremacist threats a priority. The tools exist, but they're being misused by responsible agencies. And the same institutionalized racism that has yielded disproportionate targeting of marginalized communities has hindered the ability of agencies to recognize the threat posed by white extremists. So as an example, the assumption that Black Lives Matter protests would be dangerous, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, can usefully be contrasted with the presumptions that led to the absence of foresight and planning when known white supremacist groups made clear weeks in advance their overt plans to descend on the Capitol on January 6th. What are the existing legal tools? It might be worth noting we have categories of crime implicated in the insurrection that include violent entry, trespass, disorderly conduct, destruction of federal property, assault, hate crimes, and even felony murder or murder in the case of the officer that was killed. And we have many more tools beyond these that I've just named. There are numerous provisions of federal and indeed even DC law to address these crimes. And we actually do have on the books other prohibitions on actions that might be described as terrorism, such as material support provisions that do cover both domestic and international cases. So it's not true that we don't have law on the books with respect to domestic terrorism. The existing investigatory tools and prosecutorial authorities are more than sufficient to meet this threat if they were fully leveraged to counter white supremacist extremism. The challenge is that's not how they've been used. Just one more word. There are some charges that are being debated right now, such as seditious conspiracy, for example, that are especially worrying. We need to think very carefully about using even the tools we already have in place. For example, sedition charges have a long history of being used against dissent, a history that tells us that indigenous protesters disrupting oil pipelines or Black Lives Matter protesters are far more likely to have these charges used against them. Normalizing the use of charges like these in cases connected to the Capitol insurrection is likely to yield greater use of them in the future against marginalized communities rather than white supremacists. For example, Professor Shireen Sanar at Stanford has noted that when cases are brought against white supremacists and militia members, they tend to fall apart or result in acquittals, whereas those that result in convictions have been brought against Puerto Rican nationalists, Muslims, and others. And so overall, I think we have the tools. We need to be very careful how we wield them in these cases. I don't at all support broad overcharging because of the kinds of precedents that get set, but I do believe that we have failed, or our government has failed, to prioritize using these tools to address the kind of threat we see from white supremacists.
Thanks very much for that, Asla. And I hope we can come back to the relationship between the tools and the dangers of overbreadth. And in fact, my first question to Katrina will touch on that, which is the tension between giving law enforcement tools, either more tools or broader tools, such as, say, a domestic terrorism statute. And then also the concern that quite a number of current and former law enforcement officers were actually participating in the attack on the Capitol. I'd like to give you the chance to open this up in either of two directions or both. One is is there a way in which the tenets of some of these extremist groups has appealed to some members of law enforcement, how we begin to address that? And then relatedly, if there is law enforcement involvement, how we think about that in relationship to both the tools that we have and any tools that we might create or expand.
Thank you for inviting me. I have to say that I think Professor Bali really sort of made my part of the conversation a lot easier, because normally when I talk about the problem of violent white supremacy and what kinds of policy solutions are appropriate to address the threat, I'm usually talking to folks in the national security community who are predisposed to thinking that a domestic terrorism statute and domestic designation of terrorist groups is the right way forward. And usually I'm the one saying we need to rethink that, and we need to slow down because of what we saw in the wake of 9/11. So in some ways, I want to just sort of reiterate some of the comments that Professor Bali has already made. I come at this from an intelligence and national security background that is in the kind of hard national security space. I was at the National Counterterrorism Center during Benghazi in Boston. I have worked at the intersection of how intelligence and law enforcement resources are prioritized, not just in general, but actually in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence with the National Intelligence Priorities Framework. And there's a similar prioritization mechanism within the Bureau that Mr. Southers may be familiar with the TRP process, the Threat Review Prioritization process at the Bureau. There is a lot to unpack about why it is that we don't prioritize hate crimes and other types of crimes in the way that we prioritize terrorism. But I think that it is really at the heart of this question that's being asked. But to back up for a second and just talk a little bit about what's going on in policing, there's, it's important to point out that the problem exists about terrorism. And so anyway, we can dive into whichever of those things interest you in the group, but those are just some opening thoughts.
Thanks so much. And apologies, the recording stopped and then restarted. So I apologize for the messages everybody's been hearing. I want to, before I turn to my next questions, I want to invite any of you to respond to what you just heard from each other. Would anyone like to chime in now or react? Or should we keep going? Okay, I think we could go either way. I think we're going to come back to some of these things, but I mean, let's maybe continue this conversation about. I mean, both Katrina and Asli, you've sounded a warning about responding by drafting new domestic terrorism laws, or about the risks of creating new tools which might create new opportunities for excess or abuse. Asli, let me turn back to you for this one, but then Erroll and Katrina, feel free to jump in. Are there some comparisons you see to what happened in the wake of 9/11 and these efforts to ask for new legislation? And more generally, what are the lessons that we can draw upon about our responses to 9/11 that might help us to engage responsibly and sensibly for the sake of both quelling these problems, but also not creating civil liberties disasters now?
Yeah, I want to actually start again where Katrina just left off and agree that we're certainly converging around a shared sort of perspective on this panel. But the reason that terrorism is prioritized in the ways it has been and has really driven government funding priorities, I think, is another part of the problem. And I hope that we get to a place where we can talk a little bit about the kinds of systemic racism that inform law enforcement and security, apparatus in this country more generally, because that prioritization was attached to a conception of terrorism that was about an us and them framework, where the threat of terrorism came from an outside group or an internal group of a Muslim community that was styled as outsiders, as a kind of fifth column. And it's in part inapposite now, because the threat that we're talking about is coming from the very heart of a community that views itself as central to the American project. And now we're sort of needing to think through like what frameworks might work here. And I completely agree the terrorism framework is not the appropriate one, and I'll turn to the 9/11 comparison. But I think that we also need to interrogate, why was the terrorism framework the driver of priority when we've known now for more than a decade that far right, or to let go of that expression, white supremacist extremism has really driven a far greater amount of violence in terms of domestic violence and domestic politically motivated violent attacks in this country than any of the categories of terrorism that we have so heavily prioritized. So one way that the 9/11 aftermath is already being invoked right now is that Nancy Pelosi has suggested, and there seems to be bipartisan support for a 9/11 style commission to investigate the facts and causes of the Capitol attack. And hopefully this commission will be more diverse than the 9-member all-white 9/11 commission that included just one woman. So already we can see what 2 decades on how government priorities might have shifted somewhat, and how we might be able to bring diversity into the way in which we think about such an investigation. But that is a welcome, I think, and necessary step. But beyond this kind of an investigation, I think actually the better comparison than 9/11 might be the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 that was also committed by a homegrown extremist white supremacist, including Timothy McVeigh, of course. And the result from that was the creation of the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, AEDPA, which restricted habeas corpus in ways that ultimately disparately affected minority communities who are disproportionately incarcerated, amended terrorism provisions that have been almost exclusively used against Muslim defendants, and altered statutes in ways that were harmful to immigrant communities. So in short, you had a white supremacist attack, you had a response to that attack, and the effect of that response was to expand existing terrorism and other laws to encompass new categories in ways that disproportionately harmed communities of color that had nothing to do with the Oklahoma City attack. Lived experience shows that the framework and terminology of terrorism serve to expand the power and budget and enhance the surveillance capabilities of those who over-police and over-prosecute communities of color. So what I think we need, rather than a post-9/11 moment or a post-Oklahoma City moment, is an overdue assessment of the distortions that have informed our understanding of what homegrown extremism is. and an understanding that existing law enforcement tools related to ordinary policing, not sedition, not terrorism, not material support, are more than adequate so long as we discard the racially distorted account of threat as exclusively emanating from Muslim communities or communities of color when it comes to homegrown extremism.
Thank you. Katrina, it looks like you want to jump in. Go for it.
Yeah, so, I remember in the wake of the Boston bombings, I was then the assistant to the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. And I remember this conversation very vividly where we talked about how different the response would have been if the bombers had used guns instead of pressure cookers, because, and frankly, if they had been white and not, brown. The way that the resources of the federal government were brought to bear were entirely different. And then we saw that play out not too long after with the shooting in Las Vegas, which, killed actually more people than the Boston bombing did. But we think about them very differently in our kind of, collective American psyche. In terms of the policy solutions, so I think that there's something really innate and frankly rooted in racism that drives some of the differences about how we think about others and where we think about threats being disproportionate or not. But I think the solutions are actually pretty clear, and they're starting to emerge, I think, a consensus around certain types of solutions that that don't trip some of the wires that Professor Bali brought up earlier. One is we've got to have better research, data, and reporting on the ideologies that underpin violent acts. We don't have great data on it today. It's a boring, not very sexy policy solution that actually, to those of us who follow this stuff, is probably number one in terms of things that will have an impact on the problem set. One of the reasons we need better data is because we need to be resourcing against the threat we have, not the threat we think we have. And the only way to do that is to really have better data. We need the executive branch to be doing a number of things. I'm heartened by President Biden's announcement of Josh Geltzer as Special Assistant to the President, Homeland Security Advisor for countering domestic violent extremism. I think it's a good step. I know Josh Geltzer and think very highly of him. But we're going to have to do something interagency and whole of government to try to get at this. I think we're going to have to deal with the recruiting problem within law enforcement, military, and veterans communities. I really think that we're going to have to change the way that we vet some of these people, all people in positions of trust and authority, including, frankly, some of our elected officials who appear to, be subscribing to some of these ideologies as well. And then I think the one place where, from a counterterrorism perspective, we could actually use some tools without tripping some of those wires is actually with financial tools and authorities, and some of the things that would interrupt financial flows that are actually quite essential to the transnational dimensions of this threat. Happy to dive in more as people are interested.
Thanks for that. Erroll, can I turn to you for some more of the sort of policy engagement? What policy tools do you think we need?
I'd just like to follow up on what Katrina said. The most, if you will, the most encouraging thing that's happened since the inauguration, specifically the inaugural address, was that we've acknowledged the threat. We've acknowledged the obvious. I was so glad that President Biden actually mentioned what the threat was during his speech. I give, and again, for Katrina, I give the ADL incredible props because I followed their data. We've had the data for quite some time. They're very, very good in keeping that information. I testified in the Boston Marathon bombings hearing, and I was trying to make the members of Congress understand that these were homegrown violent extremists. And I got pushback from a member of Congress who wanted to make them foreign terrorists. And I said, well, Jahar Tsarnaev was 9 years old when he got here. So unless you believe that he came here as a 9-year-old terrorist, and now he's 19, we own him. I'm not proud of that, but he was radicalized here. Then we move on to Vegas, as she mentioned. With all due respect to the Bureau, who I'm very proud to have been an agent, it was a very disappointing assessment of that shooter's background, which has incredible ties to anti-government conspiracy theories. He's been deemed another lone wolf. I want to speak to Professor Bali's comment, though, about laws and the slippery slope we could be on. And she's absolutely right. 2 years ago, the FBI decided to push a notion of something called BIE, Black Identity Extremism. And they had decided that there was this Black separatist movement in the United States that was targeting law enforcement. Well, first of all, there's data that suggests, not just suggests, that documents that for the better part of 9 years, all the extremist shootouts with law enforcement came from the right wing, 81%. So they decided we're going to have this threat of Black identity extremists. And I remember Congressmember Bass taking on Attorney General Jeff Sessions at the time and asking him what he felt a homegrown violent extremist was. And he didn't have an answer. She asked him about the Klan and he seemed puzzled. So we went on then to have more conversations. I testified in front of the Congressional Black Caucus along with another former FBI agent on the dangers of this Black identity extremism report that came from the FBI, documented very poorly 6 instances of how this was going to be real. And before vetting it to anybody, distributed that information to 11,000 law enforcement agencies in the country. Fortunately for us, after several efforts, we got Director Wray to pull it back, suggest that BIE is not going to be used, doesn't really exist. And 3 months ago, it's out there again. It's out there now being pushed by the FBI. So we're back to square one. This is what makes it so difficult. We always want to pivot to the ethnic or religious minority when it comes to violent extremism in our country. We have not cornered the market on something that hasn't happened globally. Americans kill each other. Extremist, ideologically motivated Americans do the same thing as other people around the world. It just so happens that the vast majority of the ones here are white males. That is something we have to own up to. That is something we need to address. And I'm so happy to hear that this administration is going to reestablish the Department of Homeland Security's Intelligence and Analysis Unit and reestablish some of the tools and programs that we had in place 5 years ago that went away with this past administration.
Jennifer,
Thanks for that. Yes, jump in, Asli.
Policy stuff, great, thank you. I mean, one point I do want to make, which I think both Katrina and Errol's presentations point to, is I think we do need to remember when we talk about systemic racism, it's important to understand that de jure white supremacy only ended really, half a century ago in this country. So when we talk about white supremacist extremists, I mean, we're talking about people that support a set of de facto practices that continue to infiltrate our security apparatus from law enforcement to military, not only in the sense that you have recruitment from white supremacist or racist gangs forming in the county sheriff's department here in LA, this kind of thing, but rather that there's a fundamental way in which our security and policing apparatus has long been geared towards policing a racial social order rather than just controlling crime. And we need to grapple with that. And this is something some scholars have called the unfinished business of the Civil War even. I mean, we need to place in that context, that structural context, the challenge that we're facing here, which goes beyond recruitment or bad apples or particular people or the role of oath keepers or 3%ers or what have you who target law enforcement and the military, and much more broadly speak to a political culture that has avoided accountability, has avoided reparations, has avoided really grappling with the history that resonates with these people and is motivating them. And so from that perspective, I think some of the other kinds of policy interventions beyond using the existing array of law enforcement tools include things like political accountability. Several times already in our discussion, it's come up that we're talking about members of Congress who hold some of these views who've been elected. We're talking about senators that supported the President Trump's efforts to block the certification of the election. There need to be meaningful, individualized repercussions politically for people that engage in this kind of sort of tacit support for dog whistle racist messaging and conspiracy theories in our government. The removal of Marjorie Taylor Greene from her committee assignments is sort of a first step in that direction around some accountability for discriminatory statements, but there are a host of other people we could all sit around and name our favorite subset. And there's a way in which one of our major political parties has become an incubator for some of these kinds of views and a home for some folks. And we really need to address what that means. And amongst other things, it means we need to strengthen our democracy, not just against political violence, but also against anti-democratic strategies of political actors that benefit political entrepreneurs that benefit from activating these us and them paradigms and using the white supremacist frame, not necessarily as overtly as what we saw at the Capitol, but nonetheless to political effect. And this means addressing voter suppression, gerrymandering, dog whistle claims about fraudulent voting, efforts to criminalize voter turnout that we're seeing right now in Georgia, a whole host of other things. And then I completely agree with Katrina's point about whole of government effort. Really, we're also talking about a whole of society effort to discuss and really begin to address, what do we want to do with social media and online platforms? What creative solutions are out there for taking away the gatekeeping functions from some of these major platforms and putting them in democratic hands, or having curation services that offer an alternative? What does civic education look like? What would it mean to invest in shifting our political culture by actually addressing the ways in which it has long centered white supremacy? This isn't just some fringe group. This is an expression of what was the heart of a political project we have failed to grapple with.
Okay, so that was huge, and you've sort of brought us, you've taken us from this space into something that's much bigger and broader about democracy and American culture. I guess I'd like to ask each of you, and then I'm going to open it up. We've got a lot of questions, and I want to be able to take some of them. But if you could look ahead, whether it's 2 years or 5 years, what's one thing that you'd like to see happen that you think is within the realm of the plausible? Like, what is one, whether it's some interagency engagement, whether it's some other tool, but what's one thing that you'd like to see happen that you think might make a difference in terms of how we, in terms of homegrown extremism and reducing its threat and impact? Erroll, why don't I start with you?
Well, I have two things. The first, obviously, I'd like to see the Department of Homeland Security's Intelligence and Analysis Unit be restored. I'd like to see assessments being done regarding the threat in this country, and that they have regular reporting to Congress. Last administration, that didn't happen. The other thing I'd like to say in the way of my advertisement, I'm sitting in front of a banner that says Lewis. It is named after John Lewis. It is a project we're working on at my center here at USC. Lewis stands for the Law Enforcement Work Inquiry System. And as Professor Bali mentioned, policing here is a problem. So what Lewis is doing, and we are a national database of police officers that have been fired for misconduct. You don't change law enforcement by policy. The running joke in law enforcement is that police departments eat policy for breakfast. You've got to change the culture. And the only way to change the culture is to change the human element. You change the human element by removing people from that profession who shouldn't be there or have a proclivity or a proven track record of being racist, of being biased, of being misogynistic, and all the other challenges that they may have along the way. So I'd like to see, again, intelligence analysis, assessments, regular reporting to Congress, and the rooting out of racist police officers across the country.
Thanks. Katrina, how about you?
So I also have two. One is, I think we need to change or enforce, in some cases, the way that we vet people in positions of trust in this country. And I think that means law enforcement officers. It also means everybody in the federal government who has a security clearance. It also means, DHS writ large. I mean, one of the things we often forget is that the largest law enforcement institution in our government, in our federal government, isn't DOJ and the Bureau. It's DHS at this point. And a lot of the policing misconduct that we've seen in the last year in particular has actually been DHS law enforcement officers and not the Bureau. And so we need everybody who's in positions of trust in this country to be being vetted for extremist views, whatever those extremist views may be. Because if you're holding views about, society, members of society that are incompatible with your role as a police officer, you shouldn't be in a position of trust at all. And then the second is something that I said earlier, and I continue to believe, we've got to resource according to the threat. We cannot continue to resource disproportionately against a terrorist threat that is extremely minuscule in terms of what the threat is today. We need to be adjusting and aligning our resources to where we actually have risk to human life. And we need better data in order to do that. Although, you know, folks have noted there is data exists. It just exists outside the federal government. We need to bring it inside the federal government, and then we need to make decisions based on it. Because right now there's a huge disconnect between how and what we prioritize and what we know to be true about the level of threat these different types of groups.
Thank you. Asli, you get two also. Fair is fair.
I mean, I'm going to reiterate some of what's just been said. I mean, if you have a situation in which you have an attack at the Capitol on January 6th, and you have an inauguration happening just 2 weeks later, and in that 2-week period, you're able to investigate 25,000 National Guard troops that have been deployed to protect the Capitol and identify 12 right there who have extremist ties. This tells us that we have the capacity and we're failing to prioritize this kind of vetting and establishing anti-racism frameworks within the recruitment and also training processes at DHS, at the Pentagon, at DOJ, and at the state and local level as well. So that has to be priority number one, and I'm only echoing both Erroll and Katrina's points in this regard. And then I'm going to just add, since I get a second, this idea that counter-extremism work and the broader charge of tackling racism and promoting a diverse and inclusive society are typically treated as separate. So we think about domestic extremism in one orbit, and then we talk about educational and community-based efforts to build a more diverse and inclusive society elsewhere. And I just think those things have to come together, because what we have failed to do fundamentally is invest as a country in a civic project. And by the way, we are alone in this. Other countries that have tackled these same kinds of problems, from New Zealand to Germany, where you've had exactly this kind of extremism manifest in their law enforcement and in their recruitment and other government agencies, have presented an sort of all front, massive press forward civic education, public programming, investment in public broadcasting, just a huge array of programs to address racism within their political culture as part of what they understand to be countering homegrown extremism. We need to embrace an understanding of homegrown extremism that is consistent with those approaches and that really centers civic education.
Thank you. Okay, so maybe your answer, Asli, to this next question, which comes from an audience member, would be about civic education. I don't know. I don't mean to speak for you, but the question is that perhaps part of why lawmakers are focusing on the potential need or desire for new counterterrorism laws is a desire to do something, and to do something visible in this moment. And of course, making laws is one of the things that they're equipped to do. And so what else would you suggest that Congress, if you're a congressperson who wants to do something that's visible and positive and meaningful in this space in response to the situation that we're in, what would you recommend? What would you brief willing and interested Congress people should be highest on their list?
Okay, so first, I have to say again something Katrina's already pointed to, which is embracing a counterterrorism frame as evidence of doing something is replicating the racist framework, unfortunately, that informs and motivates white extremists. I mean, it's saying basically this is an us again, there's an us and a them. And again, we can somehow isolate this group and we can treat them as other, and we can deploy very comfortable otherizing frames in order to show that we take the threat seriously. But we do that by trading on dog whistle politics. So we absolutely should not do that, but we should act. So let's say civic education, I've already made that point. Let's turn back to the online platforms. I mean, we have a total regulatory void here, and we have a real conundrum about how do we want to think through the First Amendment. I want to note again, we didn't have any difficulty abrogating the First Amendment for Muslim communities and essentially using their political speech as evidence of criminalized dissent all the time. Now, I don't want to generalize that framework. I want to do the opposite. I want to take the time now that we didn't take after 9/11 to think through the civil liberties implications, but also think about how to hold these platforms that are mega, wealthy platforms that have witnessed, between Amazon and Apple and others, their wealth double and triple in the midst of a pandemic that has immiserated the rest of the country. I would like to think about ways to hold them accountable. And I don't just mean accountability necessarily through legal mechanisms. I mean thinking about the competitive market that does or does not exist, and that might enable, for example, different curation mechanisms, different gatekeeping mechanisms, different ways to filter information to not amplify harmful messages because they get the most clicks and they sell the most ads. So thinking beyond the Facebook Supreme Court to what kinds of public-minded action can government take, both to enhance the competitiveness of the market and to directly hold these platforms accountable.
Thank you. Katrina, you're up for the same question.
So I've spent the last 2 years at the Center for American Progress working on developing a national policy blueprint for countering violent white supremacy. And we are nearing the end of that project, and we'll be rolling out the policy blueprint in April. And one of the things I've learned in the course of, over 150 conversations with stakeholders across the spectrum of this problem set, everyone from counterterrorism and law enforcement officials to the people who are actually affected by white supremacist violence and faith leaders and everyone in between, is that there's a lot of unity and common cause around this problem set that is actually not being harnessed effectively because the coalition is really focused on what they don't want the federal government to do. And there's a real opportunity to be for something rather than against something. And I think, with what we're going to do, which is way too, it would be way too detailed to talk about here, is lay out specific actionable policy steps that the federal government can take. We're primarily focusing at the federal level to counter violent white supremacy. But one of the things that just happened while we've been on this call that I want to call out because I think it's a really interesting point. And it gets to the role that leaders play, which sort of pulls in what Professor Bali was saying earlier and Mr. Southers as well, is the Biden administration has just announced that they are going to change the way we talk about immigrants. And we're going to stop calling them aliens and call them non-citizens. And I have to say, part of me is like, absolutely. It's the simplest policy step imaginable, just to change the way you talk about groups and the language that we use and how powerful it is, particularly in the hands of our nation's leaders. And so there's quite a lot that we can do that it gets to the heart of cultural change as opposed to criminalization of things as the way forward.
Thank you for that. And yes, words matter. Erroll, I want to give you the chance. Erroll, I want to give you the chance to weigh in on this question as well.
No, thank you. And I'd like to add to what Katrina and Professor Bali have mentioned, is that there's a community engagement piece that is really important here. You've got 3 elements that make up people who engage in these kinds of activities we saw on January 6th. You've got your alienated individual who feels they're not part of the mainstream, where they feel they've been victimized. You've got this legitimizing ideology, which today is like someone sitting down with a menu and checking all the things that they like. Some of them are even counterintuitive. I don't even know why they match up. But third, and most importantly, you've got this enabling community. And that's where we can make a difference. I'm on the board of Advisors for Life After Hate, which, as you probably know, is an organization that was formed by largely right-wing extremists, former neo-Nazis, although we cover the spectrum from jihadists to neo-Nazis. I'm also working with a group called Parents for Peace. And those are parents of people who get radicalized, and we try to pull them out of the movement. What's really interesting about that is that we speak to groups who don't even know that this threat exists. We had a really interesting spate over this past year of attacks on houses of worship, not just here in America, but around the world, with regards to them being targeted. But most importantly now, and I bring this up because we're working with groups called CVE, Moonshot, and ADL to redirect people online who are trying to connect. I wish I didn't have to tell you this, but we are now getting pinged at Parents for Peace by young people who are telling us, my parents are radicalized and believe this, and I don't know what to do. And so that's where we are. This is an incredible space that we're in, but most importantly, they recognize it. So with all due respect, those dozens of arrests being made by the FBI every week are being made because these people don't live in a vacuum. They're out there. They live, walk, breathe, and work among us. People know who they are. And to Professor Bali's point earlier, there has to be consequences. You can't attack the Capitol on January 6th and then go home after staying a night in the hotel and go back to work. Or better yet, go to Mexico on vacation. You shouldn't be able to do those kinds of things. So until we are able to educate people, make them more aware of this threat, have them engage in helping us identify and address these people, and then have true consequences, we're going to have a problem that's going to persist forever.
Thank you. Now we only have 5 minutes and we have about 10 questions. Let's get some quick answers to just a couple before we have to conclude. One, I'm going to direct back to you, Erroll, which is a couple of people have asked, what about left-wing extremism? Where's Antifa in this conversation? What would be your quick response to that?
My quick response to that is that, first of all, as Director Ray mentioned earlier this year, Antifa is an ideology. So if you want to target an ideology, I guess it'd be like targeting white nationalism. Let me give you some data, because I try not to shoot from the hip. Harvard did a study of all the protests between June and July of this past summer, 7,305. 1% of those protests resulted in police officers being injured. 3.7% of those protests involved property damage or vandalism. They were largely peaceful. With all due respect, there was one person killed by Antifa during the course of that time, and that person was killed later by law enforcement. So if you want to talk about deaths, if you want to talk about arrests and or violence and vandalism, the data is overwhelming with regards to the number of right-wing extremists and white supremacists who for the past 10 years have dominated the deaths of people in this country domestically when it comes to extremists being the perpetrator.
Thank you. I'd like to, I'm going to ask a couple more audience questions here. Several people are interested in, Katrina, you said this most explicitly, but I think you all endorsed the idea that there's a little bit more vetting of law enforcement, potentially elected officials and others. How do we do that? What does that look like? Can we be one step more concrete about how that might be operational, and also how it might link? Somebody else asked about First Amendment rights, including those of police and law enforcement. How do those fit together in 30 seconds? So
yeah, my short answer is very carefully. That's how you do it. The slightly longer answer is we have models for how you do this well, and they exist in the military actually, where we already have standards of conduct that have stood the test of time. They aren't enforced as thoroughly as they could be, but they do serve as a model for what it can look like to establish neutral, principled standards of conduct for people in positions of trust. And you can do that by making that part of your employment contract on the front end with law enforcement officers. You can do it through the security clearance process for federal law enforcement in many cases. You can do it through OPM, the Office of Personnel Management in the federal government. It is very likely to be something that I detail in with a lot of focus in our policy blueprint in the next couple of months. But it is something you can do, but you do have to be mindful that you can't police people's thoughts. That's not, we have to thread a very careful needle here, because you can imagine a situation in which those types of conduct standards too could become tools to use against the very people that we're trying to protect.
Thanks. Another question is about, I guess there's sort of flip sides of this, the ineffectiveness of the training and education that we've done thus far as part of civic education around issues of discrimination, but also the increasing radicalization of different components of society. Are there ways to believe that if we went about this differently, that we might be able to get different results, right? That we might be able to create a more inclusive society on the one hand, and also keep some of those who are becoming radicalized to the point of being at risk of violence, that we might be able to help some of those people down other more pro-social paths. Maybe Asli and Erroll, can I ask each of you to take a quick stab at that as our last question?
I mean, the election of President Obama was really an inflection point in terms of the driver of this degree of radicalization amongst homegrown extremists. And it really points back to the earlier points I was making about the unfinished business even of the Civil War. It's the failure to address, to imagine we're in a post-racial society when we haven't grappled with the fundamental challenge of racism. That means that a Trump, a political entrepreneur, can say, a Black guy becoming president, frankly, suggests to me that he's not an American. This isn't an American outcome. And those narratives, instead of being addressed frontally, were either treated as a kind of marginal phenomenon or, disparaged in a way that didn't ultimately address the sort of fundamental conundrum that they have a deep history in this country as part of a narrative of who we actually are that we have to grapple with. That's a huge project. It's not, can we do this better overnight? But I think the Biden administration is making a set of commitments that don't involve putting on blinders and asserting we're post-racial because we elected an African-American man as president, and then allowing the festering of this, not subculture, but overt set of organizing in directly racist fashion that has catapulted so many people to the highest echelons of our elected government, and therefore created an even larger platform to broadcast these messages from.
Thank you. Erroll, I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, the last word is, and again, I'm the data person. You know, polls show that 10% of the Americans believe that it's acceptable to hold neo-Nazi views. 12% supported the attack on the Capitol. We cannot normalize what happened on January 6th in any way, shape, or form. That's where we start.
Well, thank you to all three of you for joining us for this conversation. There's many more questions we didn't get to, and I think we could have kept going for another hour, but I really appreciate your time and your insight and the work that you're each doing to try to help us address homegrown extremism and make our society and the institutions within it better and more inclusive and stronger. So thanks for being with us today, and thank you to the audience for their excellent questions. Take good care. Bye, everybody.